Hey everybody, Asher here with Game Law. That's right, a first edition of a feature that I've long promised on this channel. But today we're going to be talking, in this series, we're going to be talking about legal issues that have popped up in the world of gaming, especially because the digital realm is one of those new frontiers of law. There's not a lot of precedent, so there's a lot of interesting things to talk about. And I think probably the most interesting thing is something that's been hot in the news for a while, that you may know a little bit about, is the CSGO gambling scandal. So that's where we're going to start with today in the series. And by all means, if you have any questions, you're welcome to put it in the comments. But let's go ahead and get started because there's a lot to cover. This is not an easy area of law. But we're going to be focusing on some specific matters or cases, as it were, as in lawsuits versus Valve Corporation, specifically McLeod versus Valve and CB versus Valve, although there will be another bunch of companion cases in the coming days. And I think probably the best way to look at these, approach these, is to give you a brief bit of factual background. Now, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with CSGO and gambling, it's a first-person shooter where as you play, you will get randomly rewarded a chest. You have to buy a key from Valve to open that chest. That costs money. Valve makes profit off of any of the keys that are sold. And there is, Steam actually has a online marketplace. So whatever items you get from that chest, it's very similar to Dota 2 or other Steam games as well, you can sell that item in the aftermarket. So Steam gets a cut of any of those sales. Digital transactions is something that's definitely been going on for a very long time across many number of games. Not terribly controversial. Where we do start to get issues is that Steam does have an API, which is pretty much code that they will give out to help facilitate third parties who maybe want to get in on some of this marketplace transactions. And CSGO has had one of the strongest sort of third-party markets out there. Now, where it becomes an issue is not just buying and selling of items, because that's something that you could do even on eBay back in the 90s. No, what becomes an issue is that some of these third-party sites have advertised allowing betting and allowing gambling of some of these in-game items. And that is where you start to get into some legal trouble, some legal issues. So to specifically talk about some of the lawsuits, and the language here from these suits kind of follows each other. It turns out they were filed by some of the same attorneys in both of these cases. So you'll probably see a few more companion cases here. There's a few specific things I want to talk about when discussing the lawsuit itself, because it is very much a lawsuit against Valve. And there are some other players that are involved, some unnamed co-conspirators, such as other websites that have allowed gambling, as well as some named individuals who have recently gotten in some YouTube controversy because they made YouTube videos for the websites that they actually ran to try and promote them. But we'll cross that bridge when we reach it. Because what we have here is essentially an online gambling enterprise, which for those of you who are unfamiliar with the date April 15th, 2011, also known as Black Friday, there's already been some fairly recent coming down from the federal government on online gambling as is. So there is some precedent there in place. But what kind of becomes an issue is that you have essentially this lawsuit is trying to, or these series of lawsuits against Valve are trying to go for a few specific things. They're trying to go for, A, people want to get their money back, whether it's someone that made a bet or versus someone who made a bet when they were a minor. So we don't just have gambling that's online, possibly unregulated, but gambling by minors, which RICO is. We'll get to RICO in a little bit, but essentially that raises some serious red flags for racketeering. Then we also have pretty much trying to get Valve and these other sites to stop their gambling practices and essentially trying to get recovery there. So the lawsuits itself are pretty broad-based. And for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the suits, they are what is known as a class action suit. You have one individual filing the suit, and then you have a bunch of people who are eventually going to tag on. And I have a feeling that class certification is probably not going to be too much of an issue for these lawsuits. For those of you who may not be aware, a class action suit requires multiple factors for one person's lawsuit to be able to invite everyone else on. Now, what you may be most familiar with is like you get a letter in the mail. It's like, oh, you bought toothpaste, and do you want to join this class action suit? You've sent a letter card in, and 20 weeks later, you get a 5-cent check in the mail or a voucher for something. There's a lot of class action suits that are out there, but any class action suit has to have multiple factors that it passes into: numerosity, commonality, typicality, adequacy, and superiority. To put those in kind of layman's terms, in order to have a class action suit, as my dogs are getting very excited about this, you have to have enough people where there's enough people being affected by somebody or some entity or some group bad conduct that you want to put them together. People are having a bad time because of the same reason. And essentially, having their cases all heard at once is essentially the best solution, instead of having a bunch of different little lawsuits. And the reason you don't want a bunch of different little lawsuits, keep in mind this is a lawyer talking, so consider the source. But the reason you don't want a bunch of tiny little lawsuits is that maybe you have person 1, person 2, person 3 who are first in line who file the case. They get their payment, but then the person who could potentially make a payment has nothing left, and everyone else is left high and dry. So class action is kind of a mechanism to get everybody in there, and they all have their issue, they all have their beef. And if it's the same kind of beef, essentially, you have to ask for certification from a judge. But I don't particularly think in the CSGO cases that certification is going to be that much of an issue, because you have a large group of people who have gambled on a website, and there are some allegations that this gambling enterprise was A, illegal, this gambling enterprise was B, unjustly enriching the owners because the odds were not necessarily tilted in correct people's favor. It wasn't fair gambling. And then just in general, there's a big issue just in terms of, was it gambling at all? Now, you'll see a lot of the community bloodlust out there if you read any of the articles or anything else like that says, let's go after these people, this is clearly gambling. But there is actually a pretty significant legal question. This is one reason to kind of pay attention to these cases. There was precedent from the Black Friday matters in 2011, essentially saying that yes, you can go after online bettors that can be prosecuted and take a civil lawsuit. Keep in mind that we are not talking about criminal charges at this point. We're talking about a civil case for lawsuit for essentially give us our money back and stop what you're doing. Is there possibility for criminal liability? Yes, but we'll get there when we get there. But what we have going on is essentially a case that's about gambling. Now, gambling is something that is defined across numerous states. There are some federal statutes. But I think one of the key questions for the CSGO scandal is it gambling under the federal statutes under RICO? Now, there are some conflicting cases here, which means this is something that is ripe to be heard before court. Some cases have come out to say essentially that if you buy like coins in a game that can only be specifically used in that game and can never be kind of taken out into the real world, courts have held that that's not gambling, even if there is like a probability or a chance that you may or may not get something from it. And if you get screwed over by RNG for making a bunch of bets on something, I think of Puzzles and Dragons as an example from something that I've played in the past. But there's a lot of things out there in the mobile marketplace where it's like you put $5 in, you hope that you get something really good. Maybe you get a turd in a basket instead. You can't sue for that. Courts have said that they don't deal in play money or some of this imaginary winnings and stuff. It has to be something that can be brought over into the real world, into cash. So anybody who's going to be defending Valve is essentially going to try and say the case is more like this mobile game where you just have skins. It's trading skins for skins. It's something that can only be used in game. But the problem that you run into with that is, and this is from the third-party websites and from Valve itself, because Valve is definitely a group that is potentially facing liability here. You have another series of cases that essentially say if an enterprise, if a gambling practice is something where something for value, consideration is given, it's kind of the bright line rule. It's gambling. So one side of the case is going to try and Valve side is going to try and characterize it. These are just in-game items. The lawsuits, McLeod, for instance, says that these skins, you can go to another website that uses Valve's API to go ahead, and the actual terms used on the websites are cash out. You can actually cash out and get payment for the items that you bet, or you can buy items through Valve's API through these third-party websites, bet them, and you can win or lose or bust. So I think one of the places where Valve may have gotten itself in trouble is that it's decided to intermingle your real money transactions and these skins. So I do think there is some potential for liability there on the civil side. But another question, kind of a big lurking question in the background, is we have these civil suits. There haven't been any criminal charges yet. Could there be criminal charges in the future? There was a Reddit AMA for a few different attorneys who do handle a lot of civil video game IP kind of work, and they kind of punted on it, saying essentially that there could be liability, but it's up to the DOJ or a prosecutor to try and go through and actually go after these people. I think there is definitely a possibility of criminal charges to be filed. Against Valve, it's going to depend. I mean, it's their API that was facilitating this, and it definitely bleeds into the RICO issues of you don't have to necessarily be intentionally allowing minor children to illegally gamble. But if you are helping to facilitate that process, you do fall under the very complicated and convoluted umbrella of RICO, which is where it comes down to, again, of are these items that are being traded, are they more like poker chips that can be cashed in or cashed out by Valve, or are they just items that are part of a virtual world and can never cross or bleed over into reality? So I think that is, if there is something to pay attention with this case, whether it's some certain named individuals who were actually running one of the websites and making videos of them winning a lot of things without disclosing that they actually ran the websites that they are winning on, that could definitely lead to some criminal action. I wouldn't terribly be surprised. Can you be penalized for violating RICO? Yes, that can include significant fines and jail time. So that is something that they have dropped the hammer on before. Like I said, there is April 15th, 2011. You can look it up. It's online gambling has been hit hard in the past, and I think this is the next chapter. But what exactly goes on from here then? We have Valve, a company that primarily makes games, who's tried to essentially go into the blue ocean of how to make profit online and digital distribution. Steam has been a resounding success. Their marketplace has been a big moneymaker for them, but is this where the bubble bursts? Now, they have already come out and said, and this is where I try and watch these developments and see, they've said that use of their API for gambling is against the terms of service, and they're going to stop people from doing that. Now, I haven't seen any reports of specific actions. I have seen reports of specific websites shutting their doors and saying, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. I've also seen reports of massive sell-offs of items for CSGO. But there is another issue to keep in mind, because Valve taking this corrective action cannot be used as evidence that they were wrongdoing before. It's a subsequent remedial measure, and what that means essentially for the rules of evidence is you can't say, hey, somebody fixed the problem before they were required to, order by a judge, so they did all the things wrong before. No, there's policy arguments that essentially say that we want people, when they see that there's a screw up or bad things happening, we need to allow them to fix it without penalizing it for them. So you can't use their change of the API kind of pulling the rug under, saying there was wrongdoing. But you can look back for the years, and it's years that has been going on, and say that, Valve should have acted on this sooner. And that's where you do get into the problems of, it's not just people losing money. I mean, at least in the United States, there's been long-standing contract rules that a fool and his money can easily be parted. You can make a bad purchase. Yes, there are lemon laws here or there, but typically, as long as it's in a legal, fair setting, adults are allowed to waste their money away. What becomes an issue is that when children are induced, and when I say children, I mean anyone under 18, because they can't be held legally to a contract. But what it comes down to is when you have minors who are allowed to do the same thing. These websites didn't have age verification, but what they did have was, as part of their verification, entering Steam credentials, Steam login, and things like that. So maybe some employees of Steam could look back and say, well, there have been some smatterings of reports of individual employees saying, yes, we know some of these websites are shady or crap. You could look and say that Steam was riding the gravy train too long and getting busted. But even then, a lot of these websites were legitimated by the fact that you had to go through Steam. That Steam was part of this. Steam was part of a lot of the login issues. You had to link your Steam account to it. And for minor children going through there, it's not too difficult to go to a store, buy a $20 Steam gift card, put it in your Steam wallet, and then go to a website. As long as you're over 13 years old, you just check a box, and then you know what, you can be 8 years old, check that box anyway, and go in, use mommy and daddy's money, and they be none the wiser. And that is where I think, like I said, even though there's civil cases right now, there could be a criminal case coming later on. Whether they go after Steam specifically or not, or some of the Valve employees, that's going to strictly boil down to how a federal prosecutor, because I can imagine this being a federal case, elects to use their resources. I do plenty of work with prosecutors, and there's a lot of cases they love to try, but they just don't have the energy, resources, or time. But when you have children involved, I think there is going to be somebody who will step up to the plate, do their due diligence with investigation, and whether it's websites or organizations that are domestic or not, they go after them. But I guess the final question is, why Valve? Why Steam? Why Valve, and why not just go after these other third-party websites? Well, there's a few reasons. One, a lot of them operate offshore, so they're not within the jurisdiction of the United States of America. Another reason, though, a more practical reason, is just deep pockets. A lot of these websites they have some assets that are floating around. A lot of these are in digital goods and everything. But when crap hits the fan, and I think we're in the process right now of everything hitting the fan, then pretty much they're going to go up in smoke. There's not going to be enough to really satisfy or pay out everything else. We saw the same thing happen with Black Friday with online gambling before. Some of these websites, they were able to pay out. Others of them settled on pennies on the dollar. But where you have Valve, Valve is a massive corporation that does have, not all the money, but does have sufficient funds to pay off a lot of people who, where if you have a class action, they could potentially pay it out. So that's why you target Valve Corporation. Even though they aren't the primary actor, they are the actor with the biggest pockets. So strategically, that's important. So what would Valve probably do here? If I had to guess, I think this is a case that's ripe for settlement. If anything, I think Valve should be wary of creating precedent. When I say precedent, I mean going to court, having a judge rule on their case, and then creating more law that can be used against them later. Because right now there is no case that's on point for digital items that can be cashed out. Are those more like poker chips, or are those just digital commodities that can only be used in game? And I think it's if Valve does get hit with the lawsuit, I think the marketplace, or the Steam marketplace, is going to change substantially as a result. But it's definitely something worth revisiting later down the road as more information comes out. I just want to try and lay some of the issues out there, but things to pay attention to. How is Valve in their response? Because they will have to file a responsive pleading. How are they going to characterize the items? I'm sure it's just going to be in-game commodities. Is there going to be criminal prosecution on this? Worth looking out for. And more importantly, how many consumers are going to be screwed because they went into gambling? I mean, I guess in closing we can say I did see some Reddit celebration. You open up CSGO on Twitch and it's actually people playing the game instead of people gambling on cases. So gamers playing games instead of gambling. I think that's the brave new world of the future that we're going into. But that's it for now. This is Asher, first edition of Game Law. Here we have more to come in the future. Feel free once again to leave your thoughts in the comments, and we'll do this again soon. Thanks for watching. Feel free to subscribe if you want to know more, and I'll see you next time.